almost felt like it. No way. Was it a flyover? August 29th? The last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet has been damaged. The main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Security Service of Ukraine are attacking Novorossiysk. The Crimean Bridge has been closed and air defense bases in Crimea have been blown up.
It's listing heavily.
It's going over there. Look how huge that ship is. Significant attacks on the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, and the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation have now commenced. The SBU and the armed forces of Ukraine are attacking military airfields, nuclear submarines, and the Russian Navy. Everything is on fire. On August 28th, GUR fighters destroyed a carrier of the caliber in the Sea of Azov. The missile ship of the Buyanin project was damaged. There it is again, look.
Oil depot.
No Russian naval fleet can effectively hide from the formidable sea drones of Maluk and the SBU. Let's thoroughly discuss all of these critical developments with the esteemed military analyst Roman Svitan right now.
Holy shit. Was this a miss?
Lightning, friends, is a reason for the SBU, our special services, to attack Russia military facilities. Here is the most interesting news. The last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet has been damaged. A source in the CHGU GPU claims that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has only one submarine left, the Kolpino. It was the only submarine capable of carrying out combat missions. And now it has been damaged. According to CHGU GPU, a military airfield was attacked last night. The Buturlenovka airbase was also attacked. And the highly distinguished 899th Guards Assault Aviation Arshan Regiment, a truly remarkable and decorated unit. For several days in a row, the Air Force has been attacking military factories in Russia. This time, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk was targeted. Damn, I can't keep up. Everything's on fire. Maybe it's the factory. The factory? Take a look at what's going on there. We're screwed. Last night, the permanent deployment point of Russian militants in Marino, Kursk region was attacked. There was a permanent deployment point of one of the Russian Airborne Forces units. The number about a company. The SBU and special services are preparing attacks on the Pacific Fleet and the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation. The Washington Post published an article saying that the SBU and Ukrainian special services will continue their special operations. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Very important information about the submarines of the Black Sea Fleet, specifically the Kolpino, which for some reason is now reported to be damaged, according to the CHGU GPU.
Damage. The Russians have only 3 submarines left in the Black Sea, the so-called launchers, which are capable of launching caliber missiles from underwater. Well, if it's damaged, then there really is damage. Why? Because the General Staff hasn't confirmed it yet. Right now, we're talking based on information from a Telegram channel. Once the General Staff confirms it, then we can say that another caliber carrier can be counted as out of commission. Well, a submarine can, in principle, be damaged in various ways. If it's reconnaissance, that means either informants or external influence using UUVs, using underwater torpedo devices. We do have so-called underwater drones. The same Toloka, the same Marichka are carrying out combat missions. And of course, there is also the impact at the places where they surface. That is, submarines approach the same Novorossiysk. They have certain docks there, technical services, and damage could be inflicted there as well. That's why, of course, this is very important for us. For example, damaging the submarines specifically, because in the Black Sea at the moment, we can't really track them down. So while we can see Russian surface ships well, if a submarine goes deep, it's very difficult to track. It's possible in principle, but for that, you need entire air operations, by the way, including the use of special hydrobuoys, that is certain means to detect the submarine. Sinking it is also very difficult, so the optimal way is to damage it while it's on the surface, and even better, near Novorossiysk. Why has Novorossiysk been waiting for our army's actions for so long? The special services seem to have forgotten about it, about the Novorossiysk direction. Most likely it's because there's an oil terminal nearby. And right now, the special services are as afraid of any Russian oil facilities as they are of fire. In other words, Ukrainian special services are quicker to run away from oil facilities than the Russians themselves. So now, of course, the question is for our army. That is, our armed forces of Ukraine are not as tightly bound to certain power structures as the special services are. They mostly act as their errand boys. But the army is already carrying out combat missions and understands for itself that if they don't destroy, for example, Russian submarines in Novorossiysk, and naturally, if they hit the oil terminal in Novorossiysk as well, then in the end, they'll have to die themselves. It's not the intelligence services who die, it's the soldiers on the front line who are killed, while the intelligence services, instead of destroying hydrocarbons under the orders of Malyuk or Budanov, just throw up their hands and say, oh dear, oh no, we can't do it, we just couldn't, and so on and so forth. That's why the army now has to take on this task, the destruction of Russian hydrocarbons, including the bases of Russian submarines. There are just too many questions. There are just too many questions. They are not fulfilling their direct official duties. Destroying Russian military targets is the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine. That's the army's job. Honestly, right now, this is actually the main task for Magyar, to use long-range strike capabilities, mainly drones, to destroy, among other things, the enemy's rear positions. And the special services should be dealing with internal problems. And we have more than enough of those. They received an order not to strike Russian oil facilities, the oil and gas sector. Of course, we are very grateful that they once lent a helping hand to the armed forces of Ukraine, but in the end, it's time to deal with internal enemies and internal issues as well. That's regarding the special services. And as for Magyar, believe me, he'll handle it. I think Magyar would send anyone who orders him not to strike a military target, such as, for example, the oil and gas sector of Russia, on the same course as the Russian warship. Of course, they'll come up with something for the 12th, offer congratulations, but as for now, I would already, after the special services have shown themselves in a very bad light indeed, because they failed to fulfill their direct duties. They didn't arrest those in contact with the Russians. They didn't arrest the person who gave the order not to strike Russian oil refineries. In other words, they failed in their task. So let the army handle it. Since the special services have already shifted into the mode of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, that is closer to that old, still Soviet school, then at least let the armed forces of Ukraine do the work now. All the more so, it's long past time for the special services to, let's put it mildly, change their focus. The main intelligence directorate should not be subordinate to the Minister of Defense, especially not a civilian one, but rather the main intelligence directorate should be subordinate to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and within it should be the same Special Operations Forces. In other words, it's a unified system, and what should they be doing there? Destroying Russian military targets, including the oil refining sector. The Security Service of Ukraine also should no longer exist. Why? Because, for example, engaging in political investigations for those in power, so-called, is something we don't need. After all, we are a democratic country, a European one. That's why all these KGB-style habits need to be reduced to zero. Those habits, I mean. And the released political investigators from the SBU should be sent to the armed forces of Ukraine, to the infantry. That would be the optimal solution. The only structure that should remain operational, truly operational, is counterintelligence. But again, counterintelligence should be placed under the General Staff, that is, subordinated to the armed forces of Ukraine. This would become the main intelligence directorate, which would include counterintelligence as well. That's it. We shouldn't have a main intelligence directorate under the Ministry of Defense, nor should we have the SBU. In other words, it simply shouldn't exist. The army should be focused on combat tasks, that is, systematically working to destroy Russia's military economy and military facilities. This is the optimal option for us. Right now, we can't afford to support intelligence agencies that, to put it mildly, aren't even catching mice inside the country at the very least.
Roman Grigorievich, the Buturlinovka airfield has been attacked. The 8999th Guards Assault Aviation Arshan Regiment. There have been explosions. There is damage. Let's discuss this.
Well, it's an assault regiment, which means there are Su aircraft stationed there, Russian Su aircraft, and a large number of them. We've hit Putulinovka several times, but we've never completely taken it out. Well, in principle, it's almost impossible to completely take out any airfield unless you have the ability to get bombers onto the runway, for example, and drop free-fall bombs, mainly concrete piercing ones, with really good bombing accuracy. If that's not possible, then at most you can damage, especially if you're using drones, the airfield's technical equipment, and any vehicles present, including Russian aircraft. I think in a couple of days, the General Staff, after decoding operational monitoring data and analyzing satellite images obtained by our intelligence, will report the actual losses. But Buturlinovka is one of the tactical aviation airfields that will be destroyed whenever possible, at the very least. The only thing is, of course, they now realize that we're starting to reach such distances, so they'll begin to disperse their tactical aviation. Attack aircraft are tactical aviation.
Roman Grigorievich. Now, we've noticed that we're intensively attacking military airfields and in general facilities of Russia's military-industrial complex. Just in the last 15 days, one military space reconnaissance unit was attacked, 3 airfields and 13 enterprises connected to the military-industrial complex. Additionally, 4 more were attacked again within the month, as well as 3 more airfields. The focus is on chemical plants and ammunition production. How do you assess the work done, undoubtedly, over these last 2 weeks?
Well, here we can actually praise our army because most of these strikes are already the work of our troops, our soldiers, the armed forces of Ukraine. Mainly both the drone forces, the air forces are involved, and the Navy, the naval fleet. So in this sense, they have their own fleet. Right now, Magyar has shown himself very well in commanding the drone forces. So there is a certain amount of work being done within the command system. This is all, in fact, the systematic work of the army, which operates against military targets. And here the word systematic is very important, to work systematically. Why? Because the special services swoop in, peck at something, run off, peck at something else, show off a bit, and then run off again. But the army, if it takes its time, slowly comes down from the mountain and takes the entire Russian herd. That's how the army operates. That's why it's optimal when the armed forces are fully formed. They don't need anyone else at all. Within the armed forces, there should be their own special services, which must carry out combat missions according to the combat charter and the oath that servicemen and officers take, at the very least the oath to the people of Ukraine, and not listen to politicians who tie the hands of the special services. But the special services, like little errand dogs, solve the politicians' problems. But the army doesn't work like that. The army can clean itself out thoroughly from within and even twist the heads of politicians who are working for the enemy. That's why this was a clear operation. The destruction of gunpowder factories, the destruction of airfields, aircraft on the airfields, the destruction of production facilities, especially electronics. So in just a couple of weeks, probably about a dozen and a half, as we've been discussing almost every other day, about a dozen and a half major significant Russian targets have been destroyed. The only thing left now is to continue, not with Maluk or Budanov sanctions. Forget about Maluk and Budanov because of the sanctions. They won't be targeting the oil refineries anymore. We need to keep destroying the Russian hydrocarbon industry using the capabilities of drone systems. That possibility exists. Magyar needs to prove himself. If even Magyar goes bad like the intelligence services, then I guess the old guys will have to take matters into their own hands, rally their friends, and just burn down the Russian hydrocarbon industry from the inside, so to speak, from within Russia.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and let us know where you're watching from. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. And that's why every comment and every subscription from you is priceless. I'm grateful to you for this. Roman Grigorievich, last night and actually for several days in a row, we have been attacking military factories in Russia. Right now, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk is under attack. What have we analyzed? So, the Tambov powder plant produces nitrocellulose powders for all types of small arms and artillery weapons, including systems of various calibers used by ground forces, the Navy, and aviation. It is also the main supplier of armor-piercing subcaliber rounds for tank artillery. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
Any powder plant is very difficult to hit and completely put out of commission. Well, at least it's practically impossible to do so with drones. So the fact that we managed to hit the Tambov powder plant today, well, it's good that we did. But in reality, we didn't inflict any significant damage. Why? Because some of the workshops are underground. Any powder plant, when it was designed back in the Soviet Union, was supposed to withstand a nuclear strike. How could any drone possibly reach it? The only way to hit a powder plant is with a warhead of about half a ton, a tandem one, meaning you have to break open the underground chambers, get inside to where the gunpowder is actually produced, and detonate it there. This is only possible by using either cruise missiles with a very long range, and at the moment we don't have any of those. Even if we get Taurus missiles at the level of Taurus, Storm Shadow, or Scalp, well, Scalp has a range of 250 kilometers and Taurus 500 kilometers. Well, we still won't be able to reach all the factories, and most of the Russian gunpowder factories are located closer to the Urals, which is already nearly 2,000 kilometers away. Right now, what's really important for us is ballistics. In other words, we need a ballistic missile program. Moreover, if it hasn't been launched yet, then the executive branch, which has been sitting there for 7 years and still hasn't started it, needs to be kicked into high gear. Ballistics isn't about hitting targets 50 or 100 kilometers away like the Toshka-U or the HIMARS with their M30 and M31 rockets. It's about reaching 2,500 kilometers, being able to strike as far as the Urals. That's what we're talking about. These are serious ballistic programs that were destroyed back in Poroshenko's time and then buried even deeper by the current government. So at this point, the executive branch has been in power for 7 years and we still don't have a single ballistic missile. Meanwhile, during this time, the Saudis use our facilities and their own money to produce the Hrom missiles and took them for themselves. So the capability exists, which means there was simply no will and no funding allocated for these programs. And that in its purest form during wartime is Article 111, state treason. Why are all these people still not behind bars? Again, these are questions for the security services who are busy with God knows what, but not their actual job. So this is a major problem for us right now. But I think the security services will listen to us and finally get to work identifying those shortcomings in the planning of the ballistic program. Why? Because without ballistics, we definitely won't win this war. And what's more, ballistics, the best, most interesting, and most effective air defense for us right now is ballistic missiles, strange as that may sound. Because any strike on our territory, if we respond with a ballistic missile aimed at Moscow, at the Kremlin, and it's only 500 kilometers, we don't need to reach the Urals, it's just 500 kilometers. How much is that? It's basically 5 to 10 minutes of flight time for a ballistic missile. And that's the optimal option. But all our authorities in recent times have simply ruined it. In other words, they didn't allow us to strike Moscow in response to attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, basically all of Ukraine. So there's a big question here, I'll say it again. Well, as for the intelligence services, of course, there are no questions for them. They should be sent into the Ukrainian armed forces. That's basically writing them off. They're useless. But the question is for the executive branch. Because if we don't replace the executive branch now, we'll never have ballistic missiles at all, and we'll fight to the last Ukrainian if we don't strike Moscow and don't destroy Russia's hydrocarbon industry. The best sanction is precisely the direct destruction of Russian oil refineries, Russian terminals, and Russia's oil and gas extraction industry. In other words, this approach should be a priority because, well, it's a good point. So we talk about it. Yes, we reached Tambov. Yes, we put on some kind of fireworks show there. Did they destroy the plant? No. Then what was the point of doing all that in the first place? So why waste drones that made it there, losing a ton of drones and decoys on the way to Tambov? So what was the purpose? Maybe it would have been easier to just hit Novoshaktinsk, the Russian oil refinery in Novoshaktinsk, which specifically supplies diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene to the Russian army. That's the question. That's what you call showing off. At this point, nobody needs that kind of showing off anymore. Either this government will work specifically for Ukraine's victory, or it can go the same way as the previous Yanukovych government. They're sitting there comfortably in Moscow, bad-mouthing each other. So Yanukovych probably dragged some of them along with him to Barvika or wherever they're staying. In other words, you can't. And I'm addressing the executive branch now. Can't you do it? Then clear the way, for heaven's sake. If you don't have the brains to accomplish certain tasks, to set them, oversee them, and deliver what we need, then clear the way and let people who actually understand these issues step in. Well, why? Because otherwise we'll all end up badly, not just those in power. The authorities, of course, will grab their hard-earned, ill-gotten property and scatter in all directions. Ukraine will be lost and Ukrainians will be lost because in this kind of situation, if we don't strike where we need to, we simply won't exist anymore. We'll just wear ourselves down in this sense. And the blame for this will lie with the executive authorities, who will scatter in all directions. That's why the question now is for those in power, specifically for those people who are directly responsible for these issues. Well, as for Tambov getting a little scorched over there, that's just like scaring the crows, as they say. Well, at least for now. There were strikes before this. We talked about this before. There was a good strike on the fuel and lubricants depot in Engels. Almost the entire depot burned down. The only thing left there is an underground reservoir and underground storage. There are several tens of thousands of tons of fuel, aviation kerosene, in those so-called Russian depots. You need to get to that. But again, you can only reach it either with intelligence service insiders or with real ballistic strikes because those caissons are in Kursk caves and you can't just get to them easily. although of course you can always try.
Roman Grigorievich, when we attacked the Iskander ballistic missile launchers in Bryansk, I read afterwards that many military analysts wrote, and there were even video materials, that in this way Ukraine was testing or trying out our ballistic missiles, and that a number of airfields were attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. These were tests, and among other things, these launches could have been attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. What is your opinion on this kind of information?
I think it's complete nonsense. Let me explain why. For several weeks now, we've been tearing into this executive branch with 6-story high curses because in the 7th year, they still don't have any ballistic missiles. And most likely they just threw this into the information space to say, no, we did something here ourselves. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So what is Klintsi? It's 50 kilometers from our border. What kind of ballistic missile do we need? A rocket fired from a HIMARS, the M31, can reach Klintsi, which is 50 kilometers away. Ballistics, well, you could say that's ballistics. No questions there. But what we need is a ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers to reach Moscow and a warhead of half a ton, not the kind of warhead that exploded in Klintsi. Well, we've seen the information flow about that. There was no more than 50 kilograms of explosives there. So that's about a 90-kilogram warhead, the so-called M31 missile. What about our own ballistic missiles? Well, if you count Iskanders, HIMARS as ours, and the M31 missiles as ours too, since we've paid for them. Yes, no questions, that's ours, our ballistics manufactured in America. That's why there are big questions for the executive branch, especially when they try to pull the wool over our eyes, claiming they've already tested something somewhere. If they had really tested actual ballistic missiles only in the capacity, I'm talking about a half-ton warhead with a 500-kilometer range, Moscow would already be burning. We've already seen this. Lenin would already be running around Red Square in his underwear and a t-shirt, shocked, shouting, "What are you doing? Have you lost your minds?" But obviously that's not happening. Then there's all this nonsense from our executive branch about how they're supposedly testing something somewhere. They could just as well test something in their own bathtub by doing a few things. That's it. They can't do anything else. It's obvious their complete impotence.
Roman Grigorievich, so the permanent base of Russian militants in Marino-Kursk region was attacked. According to military analysts, the permanent deployment point of one of the Russian airborne forces units is or was located there with a considerable number of personnel. We're expecting good news in the General Staff's report. What do you think?
Well, the permanent bases of Russian paratroopers, by the way, right now there are some serious battles going on in Turpin, for example. Mostly it's either Crimean paratroopers or those from Ivanovo stationed there. So basically they took all the men from Ivanovo, the so-called city of brides, and told them they'd be paratroopers. And now all the girls from Ivanovo have joined the LGBT community. What else are they supposed to do if there are no men left? So naturally, the permanent deployment point, which is located not far from Tetkino, is Risk. As we've discussed before regarding the strikes, it's mostly Risk. Elgov is on the right bank of the Sim River. They're active. They've been operating around Mariinka, and just recently the bridge, last night, in fact, the bridge near Tetkino was taken out. In other words, there is serious work going on there, military operations aimed at destroying the enemy's rear positions. This is what they call the army's rear area. So either permanent deployment points or command posts and control systems are being identified and tracked. Moreover, you can clearly see systematic work in the Kursk direction right now. All branches and types of troops are being used, probably except for the Navy. Although if there are Marines there, then most likely the Navy is involved as well. So all branches of the armed forces are actively operating in the Kursk direction. And this systematic approach is producing results. Starting from the destruction of command posts with a large number of Russians. Recently, a Russian Su-35 was taken down, as we discussed not long ago. So they eliminated it as well, and that was in the same area. This is, so to speak, the full package of combat tasks being carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine. You could say that the summer of 2025 is the summer when the Ukrainian army is fully taking shape. Now it's truly complete. Well, the only thing we don't have right now, the only thing is space capabilities. That is, we don't have what are called space forces, although I think we'll get to that in due time as well, because we have practically everything else from submarines to aviation.
Kirilo Budanov stated that cooperation between Russia and North Korea is already having a direct impact on the war in Ukraine. In particular, the head of the main intelligence directorate emphasized that Pyongyang is actively supplying Moscow with weapons and multiple launch rocket systems. As an example of such cooperation, Budanov cited the North Korean KN-23 or HN-23 ballistic missiles. He noted that the first batch of these missiles used against Ukraine was of extremely poor quality. Almost half exploded in the air or veered significantly off target. However, thanks to assistance from the Russians, these missiles have been greatly improved. This is a direct result of the joint work of specialists from both regimes. And accordingly, this is causing great concern, Budanov said. Roman Grigorievich, please go ahead.
Budanov is absolutely right. At first, the task for the KN-23, the Korean missile, was simply to hit the planet. But they couldn't even accomplish that. They exploded in the air. They couldn't even hit the planet. And then when they started bringing these missiles into our theater of military operations, most likely Chinese and Russian engineers got involved and perfected the missile. And now it's at the level of the Iskander, maybe even a bit further. In fact, I think it can go up to 200 kilometers farther than the Iskander. Some of its variants can reach up to 700 kilometers, and its warhead is about 150 kilograms heavier. So basically, the missile has become quite dangerous at this point, especially after skilled specialists got involved in its production. Now, they only got involved in the production of this missile just a few months ago, or, well, let's say it was last year. Meanwhile, our authorities have been sitting around for 7 years and still can't manage to create this missile, especially considering that we had already developed it before. At the very least, we could have recreated it. I mean, even the same Grom-2 missile that we had, which was handed over to the Saudis. So they can't even manage that. Look at the North Korean donuts. They don't even finish eating them. Most likely, they give the leftovers to Kim Jong-il because soon he's going to burst. But seriously, of course, they can't do it. They don't participate in the world economy. They're completely cut off by sanctions. Nevertheless, these are ballistic missiles capable of reaching, if we had them, Moscow, which is 450 kilometers away, and these can go up to 600 or 700 kilometers. So they managed to do it. In other words, the North Korean donut was able to make these missiles. But our Minister of Defense, our donut, couldn't make these missiles. So they seem pretty much the same. One is just a bit wider than the other, but one has missiles and we don't. That's a big problem. So in this sense, Budanov is right, in the sense that he provides accurate information. Yeah, but what's the use of this information? It doesn't really make any difference to us, this information itself. If Budanov were saying right now that the missile production in North Korea had been destroyed, now that would have been something that would have been a real achievement. Because the issue isn't about Budanov, it's about a systemic error, our systemic error in building up the armed forces. It shouldn't be like this, where we have about a dozen security agencies, a dozen of them, and they're all just drifting around, each doing their own thing. During wartime, everyone should be under a single command. The GUR should be under the command not of our Ponchik, but under the chief of the general staff. Ultimately, it should be under Gnatov's command, and then we won't be listening to or even hearing Budanov at all. Frankly, we shouldn't be hearing from him. Tell me, please, who is the head of the GRU of the Russian General Staff? No one knows who he is. Why is your information classified? You hear Budanov everywhere. That's just not the right path. That's not the way of intelligence work. That is, they are supposed to carry out combat missions. By the way, that's why the Russians have the GRU of the General Staff. GRU stands for Main Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff, while we have the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense. Do you think there are fools sitting over there or something? But here we've created a certain structure just to siphon off money and drift around aimlessly, as they say. The Main Intelligence Directorate needs to be brought under the General Staff. Under the General Staff, right now under Hnatov, he'll quickly set them straight and assign them where they need to go and what they need to do. It's the same story with the security service, as I've already mentioned. Counterintelligence should be under the Main Intelligence Directorate and the General Staff, and everyone else should be lined up as part of the armed forces of Ukraine. We don't need political games in a democratic country. They run around with folders, opening files on everyone. Who said what? Who gave a dirty look to these office rats, and so on and so forth. So their problem is at the very least stepping into something that's not their business. But regarding North Korea, concrete decisions need to be made right now. It's not far away, really not far at all. North Korea and Ukraine share a border. Don't be shocked now. The Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic borders North Korea along the Tonkaya River and the Tumanaya River. That's why this issue needs to be addressed right there, where, for example, our intelligence services should be working. Specifically, this issue, the re-establishment of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic and engaging in hostilities with the North Korean donut along the Tumanaya River. That should be our objective. We'll see, because anything can happen. Recently, a North Korean ship landed in the wrong place. Well, ships don't just fall for no reason. That's precisely how it typically goes, you see.
Dear audience, as always, please give this video a like. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as Ukraine itself. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression. That's why every subscription and every comment from you is invaluable. I will be grateful to you for all of this. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan, we work 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much.